pleasure to introduce Douglas Barker. I consider him an encyclopedia when it comes to things. He knows quite a bit about everything.
Yes.
Douglas R. Barker, metaphysical teacher, light worker, art history instructor, and passionate world traveler. 14 years of residence in Europe changed his life forever. Major influences: Alan Watts, Rudolf Steiner, trained in his alternative education system, the Waldorf schools. Osho became a disciple. Diploma in astrological counseling from a school in Switzerland. Initiation as a priest of Wicca. Invitation in the use of sacred Native American pipe. 4 years residence in Sedona. Ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru. Certificates in mediumship and hands-on healing from Harmony Grove Spiritualist Association, and most recently Hawaiian shamanism. Douglas is working today with tarot, Lemahan, mediumship, goddess cards, and shaman stones. Douglas is an art history instructor, a professional light worker, and a passionate world traveler. Oh, we've already read that, okay. So now I'd like to introduce Douglas Barker, please.
Well, good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Everyone hear me all right? Good, good. Well, I've already talked down here about dragons and about unicorns, so I guess it was about time to tackle fairies as well. Now, first of all, most people who are involved in metaphysics believe in fairies, or they accept them, but most people have kind of a vague idea of what fairies actually are, or about the kingdom that they come from. The word fairy is originally fey, F-A-Y, and it's derived from or is related to 3 different words in Latin. First of all, fatum, which of course means fate. This is referring to the fates, the goddesses who ruled over human affairs and who would visit the cradles of newborn children. The fays were, or fates were also 3 women in Greece, the Moirae, and they were the 3 Norns in Scandinavia, who would weave and cut the threads of fate for each human life, and probably represent aspects of the triple goddess, the maiden, the mother, and the crone, corresponding to the waxing full and waning moon. Even the gods were subordinate to the fates. Now, there's also the verb fatare, which means to enchant, which is, after all, a way of changing one's destiny. And they're also the word is also related to the Fatui, who were a species of nymphs, a race of immortal damsels who haunted places such as remote waterfalls, woods, and fountains, and were referred to by English occultist Lewis Spence as spiritual maidens of the forests and elements. Well, you get the idea. Well, anyway, fey, which eventually became fairy, meant as an adjective enchanted, bewitched, or magical, as in the terms the fairy knight or the fairy queen. And as a noun, it meant either the state of enchantment or an enchanted realm, like fairyland, and eventually fey or fairy came to mean one of the inhabitants. Now, it's interesting to note fairies exist in numerous non-Western traditions as well. For example, there are the well-known Dakinis in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition, who are quite similar. They're female energy beings who appear in dreams or visions or even in human form. And they often appear at twilight and speak a mysterious twilight language, and very importantly, they transmit wisdom to people. Now, the kingdom of the Fae, or fairyland, is really a realm of the etheric world, the world of the formative forces of life, and a parallel dimension to ours that interpenetrates our own, in which the Fae are the personified energies of that world as they appear to the imagination, and in which form they can communicate with us. But the term fairy is now really pretty much a generic term for a wide variety of such beings, which would include brownies, who are small, hairy, and ragged, and commonly attach themselves to families to help them out, and they would stay with them often, even if they moved to another dwelling. In some cases, even when they immigrated to Canada. There are elves who come from the Germanic Scandinavian tradition. Pixies, they have small turned up noses, red hair, and squint eyes, and who either wear green or go naked, and are particularly concentrated in the English West Country, Devon and Cornwall. Sprites is a generic term related to spirits. There are the Welsh fairies, the Tylwyth Teg, which means the fair folk, who are small and beautiful and generally wear white. And of course, the Irish leprechauns, who wear coats and hats, are shoemakers, and have a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Now, important to note, fairies are not always tiny. In some traditions, they can be the size of a human being or even 7 or 8 feet tall. But our modern conceptions of the fairies derive primarily from Celtic, Greco-Roman, and Germanic traditions. And there are a variety of beliefs about where do fairies actually come from. Well, if we follow them back, we find that in many traditions they really relate to the spirits of the dead. In Irish and in Scots Gaelic, we have the word she, which is spelled S-I-D-H-E, and that means a fairy, and it was originally the term for ancient burial mounds, which were often referred to as fairy mounds. These were also considered entrances to fairyland, the land of the dead, and fairies and the dead were both thought to live underground. And when we think about this, when a person dies, after 84 hours, the last of the etheric body has dissipated, and it doesn't just go into a big kettle of soup or something like that. It begins to become active in the forces of nature and around plants and things like that. Now, another idea is that fairies are a distorted folk memory of earlier races who had lived in those areas, who were smaller in stature than the later arrivals, and who had since disappeared. They dwell in caves or in underground chambers for their own safety. They're nocturnal in their habits, and they wear green in order to camouflage themselves in the forests. However, there are a number of pygmy-like races that still exist in various parts of the world, and it's interesting to note that they themselves have beliefs about such beings who are smaller than themselves, spiritual beings. Nevertheless, the earliest beliefs about such beings is probably indicated by the Irish word she, because it actually is related to a word that means peace. So the she would be the people of peace, and that could well refer to this earlier Neolithic period, the late Stone Age, from about 10,000 to 5,500 BC, in which it was predominantly a rather peaceful and goddess-worshipping culture. There's also the popular belief that a piece of cold iron can be used to banish harmful fairies, which could relate to the idea that the matriarchal cultures were put an end to by Iron Age warriors who had weapons of iron. Now, also, the female nature of most fairies is probably preponderant because the teachings actually derive from these earlier matriarchal cultures. And this identification of earlier peoples with nature spirits also occurs in Hawaii in the beliefs about the Menehune. Now, another theory is that the fairies are shrunken remnants of Celtic gods and goddesses who were deposed by Christianity. Well, hierarchically speaking, there is a difference between deities and nature spirits, but there do seem to be a few fairies who appear to be descendants of the old gods, and their functions overlap. And we should also take note that fairy beliefs do antedate the Celts themselves. Now, when we come to the Christians, what did they believe about fairies? They thought they were fallen angels. And by the 17th century, the English Puritans and the Puritans in the United States believed that they were outright demons in the service of Satan. Well, a more charitable Irish belief is that the fairies were indeed fallen angels. However, they were not wholly in the service of Lucifer. They weren't good enough for heaven, but they weren't bad enough for hell. So as they were falling, the Son of God suddenly held up his hand, and they were stopped short in flight and fell to earth. The most wicked of them fell into caves and caverns below the earth, and they became gnomes and kobolds and other light-hating creatures. Some of them fell into the sea and became mermaids and water spirits. Others fell into the woods or flowery places or next to men's habitations. and became brownies whose duty it was to work for people without reward. Well, for theosophists and other occultists in the late 19th century and until today, they were devas, spiritual forces or beings behind nature, and you could be trained to see them. And they ranged all the way from solar angels who dwelt in the sun down to the group souls of different species, and finally the more earthbound fairies, nature spirits, and elementals. Elementals would appear to people, according to the theosophists, as small, hazy, luminous clouds of color. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who was an avid spiritualist, once wrote, "That growth of a plant which we regard as the customary and inevitable result of associating the three factors of sun, seed, and soil would never take place if the fairy builders were absent." Now, our modern conceptions of fairies lean heavily on Anglo-Celtic traditions and Victorian sensibilities. Has anyone ever come across any of Andrew Lang's fairy books? The Red Fairy Book, the Green Fairy Book, the Lilac Fairy Book. Between 1889 and 1910, he turned out 12 books of fairy tales, each one of which had a color. Have you ever come across Cicely Mary Barker? No relation to me. And her Flower Fairies, very popular. In 1923, she started publishing those books with the pictures in them. And then the English theosophist Geoffrey Hodgson, who wrote a good number of books, also wrote a number of them on fairies, beginning with Fairies at Work and at Play in 1925. Now, books of fairy tales, which are well known to us, they first appeared in France in the 17th century. And then in the 19th century, it got another big boost from the work of Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm in Germany. Another big influence on modern sensibilities, in 1911, a book appeared by W.Y. Evans Wentz called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. And he had gone and spent a good deal of time in the British Isles researching these things. And he came across a young man who had actually had a meeting face-to-face with a fairy in the late 19th century. And in response to Evans Wentz's questions, he reported that the gentry, as he called them, as if they were upper class, was, quote, a military aristocratic class, tall and noble appearing, unquote. They were a distinct race between us and those of spirits. They were very powerful. They could strike a being temporarily with paralysis. They had sight more penetrating than that of humans. They were ever young. They could marry and have children, and under certain circumstances, even marry mortals. And they could shapeshift and change their size. They also take a keen interest in human affairs and can carry off humans sometimes, and to a certain extent control their thinking. Now, when you look at those descriptions, they sound remarkably similar to encounters with ETs, who may in fact be the same beings. Now, in Irish mythology, we have the Tuatha De Danann, which means the people of Dana, D-A-N-A, who is akin to a mother goddess, and this is a fairy race, and they dwell in Tir na Og, which means the land of youth. Certain fairies would be attached to a specific family. You may have heard of Irish banshees. Banshee means fairy woman, and they would wail before someone in the house died. She's an aspect of the dark goddess. In Scotland, she's often known as the washer by the ford. And there in mythology, we see this woman standing in a ford in a river, and she's wailing and she's washing blood-stained garments and armor of warriors about to die. However, nowadays you can actually do guided meditational journeys to encounter her. In other words, for the purpose of removing outworn negative habits and old emotional programs that hinder us, and washing our souls clean and preparing them for rebirth. In Scotland, fairies are divided into the Seelie court and the unseelie court. Seelie comes from the German word Seelish, meaning blessed. But the Seelie court are those fairies who show friendliness to humans and help those whom they like, although they can also be mischievous and even avenge insults. And the unseelie court consists of the more darkly inclined fairies who can attack humans without provocation. For a good depiction of the fairy kingdom, how many of you have seen the 1935 film, A Midsummer Night's Dream? is one great film to watch. Victor Jory plays Oberyn, the king of the fairies, and a very young Mickey Rooney plays Puck. Now, in Wales, the Tylwyth Teg, the fair folk, were headed by a fairy king, Gwyn ap Nudd. Now, I had something of an experience with Gwyn myself. On one occasion, I was up on top of the downs with a party of people, and we were all on horseback doing a day ride. And we came close to one of those Iron Age hill forts, that there are a few hundred of them in Britain, which people used to refer to as fairy forts and thought of them as entrances to the underground. And as we were riding along, all of a sudden, I found myself going like this and feeling very, very out of it. And the next thing I know, I suddenly noticed that I'm standing on the ground. I'm walking next to the horse with my hand resting on its saddle, and there's another fellow standing beside me. And I said, "What happened?" He said, "You got thrown from the horse and knocked unconscious. And then you suddenly got up, got on the horse, rode about 100 yards, got back off the horse and started walking next to him, and now you're here." So I got kidnapped by the fairies. and so one of my friends in the village, who was a Kabbalist and a magician, took down a message in automatic writing, and it came from Gwyn ap Nudd to me. And started out by saying, "Tell Douglas he must learn to regulate himself. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." Anyway, now, fairies do have a morality, but it doesn't always quite correspond with that of humans. In general, fairies expect cleanliness and order, and they expect this from humans when they visit. They have no scruples about taking a mortal's goods when they have need of them, but they will severely punish any mortal who steals anything from them. They hate miserliness, and they usually have a free, open, cheerful character. They love music and dancing. They influence the growth of crops, and because of their interest in fertility, they're very free and amorous in their conduct, and may take human lovers, sometimes even marry them. There are numerous fairy tales, in fact, in which some man takes a fairy wife, and they end up living very happily together, but there's always a condition. Usually the man is warned he's not allowed to ask her anything about her origins, or he's not allowed to tell anyone else. And of course, there's always a failure, and what happens is the fairy and all of her gifts disappear. They're also passionate about privacy, and they punish spies and eavesdroppers. Now, fairies travel along spirit paths, in other words, what we would think of as ley lines. And there are stories primarily from Ireland where people have experienced continual bad luck, and then they found out that the house that they had built actually overlapped a fairy path. So what they would do is cut off a corner of the house, make the wall thinner there so it wouldn't obstruct the fairies when they wanted to go through. Sometimes they'd build cottages where the front and the back door were aligned, like a shotgun cottage. And that way, in case of necessity, they could leave both of the doors open, and the so-called trooping fairies could ride through at night. Fairies also inhabit fairy rings. Whenever you see mushrooms growing in a circle, that's a fairy ring. And then the Iron Age hill forts, which I told you about earlier, and which actually were probably ceremonial centers, not forts, they were also thought to be the dwelling places of fairies. Occasionally, they will steal a human baby if they take a fancy to it and leave something else in its place, which was referred to as a changeling. And sometimes if children were born with birth defects of some kind, the family would say, "Oh, it's a changeling, the fairies exchanged him." Also, they would sometimes carry off young men if they had skills that they needed, or young girls as brides, especially if they're blonde. Another common habit they had was to visit houses at night in order to bathe their babies in water that would be left out for them. Well, the room had to be left tidy, the hearth swept, the fire made up, and fresh water left in a pail by the fireside. And the maid who attends to this will find sixpence in her shoe the next day, and will be left after every visit as long as she keeps it a secret. However, a maid who neglects her duties is punished with either cramps or lameness. For flight or levitation, fairies make use of a sprig or stem of ragwort, kind of like a witch's broomstick, as well as an incantation. Now, many stories deal with their trickery and their pranks. In fact, the fairies really are mirrors for us, because they reflect back to us our own light and darkness. And by meeting them, we meet ourselves. For those who are pure of heart, the fairies may allow them to find their hidden treasures, which are magical or spiritual gifts. Consequently, the country folk in these areas were very careful not to offend the fairies. And whenever they spoke of them, they would refer to them as the gentry, the wee folk, the good folk, the fair folk, etc. And due to the rather variable nature of fairies, as well as the influence of Christianity, many people would avoid places that were supposed to be associated with fairies, or they would carry various types of protective charms, like a 4-leaf clover, a piece of St. John's wort. They might wear an article of clothing inside out, or carry a piece of dry bread in their pocket. Also, it was common for people to leave food offerings out for the fairies, like bowls of cream and things like that. And often the fairies would respond by rewarding them. When I was in Scotland, I had a friend who was a pipe major, who'd never in his life worn trousers, always wore a kilt. And he was telling me about the ferry brig, meaning the ferry bridge, which was not too far away from where he lived. And it was an old, beautiful stone bridge, which was now by the side of the road because it was too narrow to allow modern traffic to drive over it, but they left a nice old bridge there. And apparently when you went past it, you were supposed to say something nice about the fairies or say hello to them or something. And he said he knew one fellow who, he told him about the story, and the fellow, oh, goddamn fairies, something like this. When he drove past the bridge, his car went off the road. So the next day I went by coach someplace or other, and we went past the ferry bridge, to which I said, "Ah, hello fairies, how are you?" Yes. Humans who visit fairyland will find that animals, plants, even the stones can speak to you and communicate with you. But often you're warned not to eat any food that they give you, because time doesn't exist in the same way over there. And what happens, people go there and have a meal and they come out and think it's a couple of days later and 7 years has gone by. Now, Sir Walter Scott, the Scottish writer, the author of Ivanhoe and a lot of other outstanding novels, was always an enthusiast for the supernatural. And in 1817, he received a visit from the American writer Washington Irving, the man who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And so they were telling each other various stories of the supernatural. And Scott told him the story of Thomas the Rhymer, who had apparently had such an experience in the 13th century. He was an actual character, and thought he was away for 7 nights to serve the Queen of Elfland, and he came back 7 years later. However, that tale was an influence on Washington Irving's later story, Rip Van Winkle. Now, during the 1960s, a form of Wicca or paganism came to birth called fairy Wicca. And this path, as you might expect, is deeply oriented towards nature and ecology and working with the fairy realm, and they work primarily with cooperative magic rather than compelling the spirits. They often work with a model of the fairy kingdom that was written down in the 16th century, although it's based on earlier traditions, and it's called the Four Cities. And they form a mandala type design, because you have the city of Gorius in the east, Phineus in the south, Murius in the west, and Phalius in the north. And there's a 5th city in the center, which is shaped like a heart, called the Glen of Precious Stones. Fairy Wiccans explore the fairy kingdom through guided meditational journeys and ritual. They plant trees, they work with animal guides, fairy allies, and various spirit guides. They work with the washer of the ford to release bad karma, and with the co-walker, who's a bit like a doppelganger, a mirror image of oneself that embodies the perfect primal pattern or template from which your own life is generated, and helps us when we're out of sync. They also might acquire a fairy lover, a union with a wisdom energy or a primal force of creation. And if they don't have a human partner in their life, the fairy will help them find one. And finally, one last thing, since early in the 20th century, individuals have begun to erect fairy houses, which are small outdoor structures intended to look like residences for fairies. They're usually made of natural foraged materials, which can eventually decompose back into the ground from which they came. And in several states, artists or communities have actually contributed ferry houses to specific trails and paths. So hopefully that has filled out your knowledge a bit on the world of the ferries. And now for something completely different. We have diplomas to hand out.
Oh.
Okay, these are diplomas for the people who attended my course on world religions and spiritual paths. Very, very nicely done up, as you can see. All the words spelled correctly and so on. Okay, so let me hand this out. Martha Costillo.
She's not here.
All right.
Oh, she is here.
Thank you, Douglas.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay,
It was a great class.
thank you. Sharon Fernandez. Yeah. Don't try to get out of it.
Thank you.
Adriana Shank.
She's not here today.
Okay. Maria Ibarra. You're welcome. Brenda McGrath. Terry Audia.
Thank
Christopher Audia, LM.
you.
Reverend Deborah Damaris. Okay. I believe now it's time for announcements.